Now that we've established three separate series discussing what makes our beloved underground both so integral and so interesting to talk about, this statement must be made in response. In 2020, it's relatively difficult to discuss the history of contemporary music, regardless of genre. But with regards to current day hip hop, it becomes increasingly more difficult to pinpoint those projects, artists, and moments that have definitively made a historic and influential impact in the ways that other eras have. And really, overcoming this challenge and delivering our best analysis possible from a team of people who have been a part of this scene and have seen it rise in the way that it has is kind of our mission statement in a way, and the reason why this channel exists in the first place. But even with that being said, there exists a certain item in this scene that the grander online music community can collectively agree is insurmountable in its influence, an item that manifests itself in 46 minutes of pure and utter defining weight. It's an album that established the now immensely successful career of its lead artist, put numerous others on the map, and continues to be arguably the quintessential benchmark release for the underground scene today. It's a project that doubled as a culmination of an era so celebrated for its embracing and utilization of the internet, and the beginning of an era that built off of it to all but create the landscape we now know today. Particular audiences might point to some niche releases that fit this mold in a vague or less than substantiated way. Well, they can give us any project they want. In response, we'll raise you one better. I'm Bill with UVC, and let's get into it. The story of Nostalgic 64 cannot be told without quickly outlining everything that came before it and how these facets played a role on its main character. Denzel Curry grew in one-to-one correspondence with the burgeoning southern hip-hop scene that influenced him as much as he would come to influence it. This was a scene defined by purposely going against the grain, against the redundant standards of the mainstream, with the goal of creating their own standards. And these standards were based solely on their own discretions. It was truly a group effort, unlike anything hip-hop had seen up to that point. More specifically, the building of this wholly unique sound based on chopped and screwed vocal passages and a decisively brooding sentiment to be used time and time again throughout an entire decade could not have happened without nearly all of its purveyors being on somewhat the same page. A brotherhood was required to achieve what they wanted to do, and a brotherhood they were. And what specifically resulted from this leading into the 2010s? Only the truest beginning and first instance of hip-hop with a primary focus on the internet. What seemed like a niche movement at the time would come to be known as a movement that effectively dictated the next few years for the genre, and possibly its next few decades. And while Denzel was not at the forefront of this era's development, he certainly did his part in continuing it. As the Carroll City native was brought up and completely saturated with this music, he became somewhat of a prodigal son to those that came before him and had such a profound impact on not only his musicality, but his life as a whole. With his academic life at odds against the powers that be, Denzel began to notice the utility gained by those who made this type of music in his area, and he desperately wanted to be categorized in the same way that they were. This led him to the release of the King Remembered Underground tape, which skyrocketed him to the levels he had desired, as it made such an impression on Space Ghost Perp, the undisputed king of this era at the time, that he would invite him to join the now infamous Raider clan. His time in the collective would see two more releases that showcased his influences more than any sort of innovation, but that sentiment would soon change as 2013 rolled around. As ironic as it seems now, the downfall of the Raider clan, a group that embodied the era that has since come to be known as integral to our current day landscape, led to Denzel and the rest of the South Florida scene's uprising. The disbanding of the collective sparked something in Denzel. intuitions that weren't concerned with explicitly taking after those that came before him, but ones that told him that it was possible to surpass them. And even still, the only way he could surpass them was to take what they had already established, the things he knew so well, and go even further. And with Nostalgic 64, he would do just that. Musically speaking, Nostalgic 64 is the cumulative embodiment of everything that had led up to its release. Whether we're talking about Denzel's own musical journey, the Southern hip-hop scene's entire history, or simply just what the Raider Clan had come to do with that very sound, it represents both an end product and a new beginning, both concepts we will embellish on in this analysis. But first, let's see how this album serves as a storybook ending to a time that is becoming slightly lost in our reflections as hip-hop fans. Though being released at arguably its most contentious period in existence, the spirit of the Raider Clan is felt throughout every single track on this album. The links that Denzel's predecessors went to in order to create the building blocks for the future of Southern hip-hop and underground hip-hop as a whole are taken in great appreciation and applied directly to this project. That sense of pure and utter darkness, all communicated with such intentionally placed technical flows and lyrical ability, it's all here, and it's so obvious. Taking a look at the tracklist in full, it's easy to see this sentiment on display with every full track presented. But from my point of view, I believe that it is most vividly depicted towards the album's middle portion, more particularly through a trio of tracks in this section, those being Dark and Violent, Mystical Virus 3, and Threats. Why these three? Well, it really comes down to how they embody that perfect bookend to the Raider Clan's influential run. They share a collective nod to the period that preceded them through their lyrical topics depicting the depressing struggle that seemingly appears in every rapper out of the Southern scene at the time. And being an equal victim of those exact circumstances, Denzel commands the art of storytelling on each of these tracks better than anyone else ever could at the time. This stands to reflect the fact that he consistently remained not only a student of the game as a whole, but a student of his environment and the people that made up that environment, most of which being his contemporaries in the rap game. But these tracks also acknowledge and send off the clan in another way, and one that might be even more obvious than Curry's performance alone. This manner is found in these tracks' instrumental progressions. As the album proceeds from track to track between these three, they essentially represent three separate eras in the scene's history. Dark and Violent is reminiscent of the lowly and subdued sounds of early Memphis hip-hop. That is, until a new age spin is thrown on the track in the form of a surprising beat switch.
Never heard no tales from the dark side. Never heard no tales from the dark side. Welcome to the land. Never heard no tales from the dark side. Yeah, 1999. What it's about?
You got it, bro. You know what I'm saying? Man, you ready to do this shit or what? Yeah. That's all we gotta do. That's all we gotta do. Out on the gang.
And then there's Mystical Virus 3. With its saxophone-laden riffs, its upbeat yet shallow demeanor, and haunting lyrical tones, is a telling nod to SGP's iconic musical methodology.
And now that nigga scream like he's Sindel, yelling suicide in this prison cell, running with them demons since the age of 12. Life's never a game, watch him cut his vein. And now that nigga scream like he's Sindel, yelling suicide in his prison cell, running with them.
And it fittingly sees a feature from another act who is consistently paid just as much respect to his prior eras as Denzel did in the form of Lil Ugly Mane. Shameless plug, go watch our Bedwetter video if you want more on that. And finally, we have the ever-popular Threats, which is basically the clan's last and most powerful breath in the form of an instrumental. It takes everything that makes a song of theirs truly their own and presents it in high definition. That's kind of how I see this track, and really most of this album. It's really as if all of the years leading up to this release, all of the classics that had come before it, were displayed on some sort of CRT. And this album just takes that image and transitions it into its highest definition, presenting everything as clear and as spotless as it possibly could be at the time. Maybe that would make like something like Imperial or Taboo like 4K resolution albums, but I mean, like, we can debate that later. Nevertheless, this album shines in its admiration and conclusive enveloping of a sound and era alike. But that's only half of its story. Now it's time to see how it opened the doors to a plethora of new beginnings in underground hip-hop. Maybe it was out of realization of his youthful age, both in the rap game and as a human in general, or maybe just born out of his creative spirit as a progressive artist in full. But Denzel certainly made it a goal with this album to set a holistic benchmark for the future of underground rap. And oh, did he certainly accomplish that. For as much as this album likes to bathe in its prior influences, it equally takes from the ever-growing and positively trending sounds that were undeniably new at the time of its release. These, of course, are the sounds of trap and drill, sounds that had yet to make the trip from their Midwest origins to the bustling southern scene at the time. But Curry decided it was time to change that, and as if he walked to Chicago himself and brought it back with him, he made sure that this sound found a new home in his domain. These features were applied by Denzel in multiple instances throughout the album, but are easily seen in tracks like Zone 3 and Talk That Shit. Both tracks feature frantic hi-hat patterns with boisterous 808s, all under Denzel's revolving and hyped flow throughout. These are two songs that are as catchy as they are full of excitement and commotion, all facets that would come to define the rest of Denzel's career. But even more than that, they were done well enough on this album that they took almost an immediate effect on the entire rap game. Without tracks like these cementing this sound in the ears of youthful southern hip-hop aficionados, we may have not been allowed to witness the rise of SoundCloud rap just a few years later. These tracks, and the album in its entire capacity, laid the groundwork for this era to begin, and it did so by coming out during a time of, again, such high contention. It was a time that needed a new beginning, something to clean the palette while still progressing forward as a scene. Denzel absolutely knew this and fully realized it, lending further reason as to why he would pull from the growing popularity of movements that weren't necessarily his own. And this effort paid off with such success, it's really not even funny. Because just a few years later, with the rise of the aforementioned SoundCloud era, this period would allow itself to lay claim to all of the credit for beginning the now infamous period in hip-hop history. This is seen through preceding moves made by XXXTentacion, Ski Mask the Slump God, and the rest of those who brought this era into reality, all being from the South Florida scene, of course. Because of Nostalgic 64, Denzel genuinely could be called the forefather of this period. It certainly is not a stretch to say that, and I truly believe it to be the case. But even before his biggest songs like Ultimate and Envy Me would break him into the hyper-mainstream and critical acclaim, this album needed to be made in order for these things to get rolling. That is the definition of new beginnings. A clean slate that Curry graciously allowed his contemporaries to draw on in order to create something completely new. If it wasn't obvious enough from this analysis, Nostalgic 64 is more than just being about the music. It's about telling a story that people had heard so many times before in a way that still interested those very people. It's about serving as the end of a period in hip-hop that carried the weight of the future on their backs, while setting the stage for that very future to become a reality in the coming years. But as it stands in the end, Nostalgic 64 is really just an amazing, ahead of its time, and nearly flawless execution of underground hip-hop. More than just succeeding at what it was originally set out to accomplish, it still stands as a fresh listen to this day, despite how much we would like to indulge in its reflective elements. It is all that needed to be said, needed to be heard, and needed to be communicated at the time. And judging by what would come next for both Denzel and the era that placed this album into motion, we cannot give it enough credit and appreciation as possibly the most landmark release in this scene that we love so much. Life may just be a game, but it's a game that Denzel Curry knows all the tricks to as far as music is concerned. Synthesize and realize, people. This album is a classic. And that is that. Thanks for tuning in yet again, and I promise that the next episode will be different after back-to-back classic reviews. I promise. As always, you can follow me on social media right here. You can follow Eddie on social media right here. And of course, hit UVC socials for everyday coverage on the underground hip-hop scene. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see y'all soon.
Got hella hoes like a Home Depot, so you already know I gotta keep that